Hello, everyone. I'm Allison Bateman House. I am a medical ethicist at NYU School of Medicine in New York City in the United States of America, and I am delighted to chair and moderate this panel presentation for you today, which is about the ethical landscape of pediatric gene therapy research. Thank you for taking time to join us for what we hope is going to be a really fascinating discussion. I am joined by three people who have really in-depth and special knowledge in this area. So I'm going to ask them each to take just a few minutes to introduce themselves and what their relationship to this topic is. And when they introduce themselves, I want them to single out for us the one issue that they find, most compelling when it comes to the ethics of pediatric gene therapy research. And we'll come back to that during our discussion in a few minutes. But so an introduction and what you find the most compelling ethical issue. So Kara, do you mind introducing yourself and starting?
Sure, thanks, Allison. My name is Kara Hunt, and I'm the project manager for the Pediatric Gene Therapy and Medical Ethics Working Group, which is housed in NYU in the United States. And I work with Allison and Andrew in this working group. So this group is comprised of stakeholders from different fields in gene therapy. It includes bioethicists, clinicians, researchers, psychiatrists, patients, and patient advocates. So we're a group of about 20 to 25 people, and together we do research, educate, and when possible, develop policy guidance for pediatric gene therapy research. And I'm delighted to be with you all here today. Oh, and it's hard to pick one because they're all very overlapping and intersecting, but I would say that transparency is one of the key ethical concerns that I have, because I think it relates to informed consent, increases accessibility, and improves trial design in various ways. So I think that's the one that I would pinpoint for now.
Great, Kara, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But first, let's have Andrew introduce himself. So Andrew.
Hello, folks. Thanks very much, Allison. My name is Andrew McFadden, and I'm the executive director of two rare disease organizations. One's called the Isaac Foundation, and the other one is called Equal Access for Rare Disorders. I'm located in Canada. My organizations are located in Canada, but we have a global scope. So we help patients wherever they may be and however we need to help them. So we provide guidance, education, and support for those families that are dealing with rare diseases. And we have a particular specialty in ensuring reimbursement of drugs across all funding systems. I'm a member of the numerous ethics working groups alongside Allison and Kara at NYU. That look at the ethics related to issues surrounding access to medicines, including this PGTME group that's being represented here today. So I come to this wearing multiple hats. First and foremost, my son has a rare disease, MPS 6 or Mertolami syndrome, and I've been alongside him as he's battled over the course of the last 16 years. So after his diagnosis, we started our organizations so that families didn't have to go through what we were going through alone. And along the way, we began funding research into projects to find cures for many other rare diseases. And we currently have two gene therapy projects that we've been funding that are now currently in clinical trials. And we've continued to support enrolling patients, providing a sort of a concierge service for patients and families to access these trials. And we also work alongside investigators to ensure that they have the best chance of success as possible of moving these trials forward. So I have a pretty good sense about the challenges associated with gene therapy trials and the worries that parents and patients face. And secondly, my son has participated in one of those clinical trials. And so I have some firsthand perspectives that I can share from a personal vantage point. And finally, I work alongside pharmaceutical companies to plan and implement and adapt their pre-approval access plans to ensure that they're as equitable and ethical as possible, including looking at possible early access programs for gene therapies. So Gosh, there's so many ethical challenges related to this topic. It's like Kara, she chose one, but then she wrapped up like 5 things in that one, which was really a crafty way to do it. But I think I'm going to hit immunogenicity as something that is of utmost concern to me, because I see the issue, causing some consternation within our own family, but all the other families across the globe that we work and represent, either because they can't get into a trial or they have been in a trial at an early stage and they need a redose, etc. So that's it from Canada right now. I'm looking forward to this discussion, and I'm going to turn it back over to Allison.
Great, Andrew. And I imagine there probably somebody listening to this who doesn't know what immunogenicity means. And I will say, don't worry, because Kara's going to explain that in just a minute. But before that, last but certainly not least, I want to let Sal introduce himself. So Sal, take it away.
Thank you so much, Allison. I am delighted to be here with you to discuss this very important topic. I'm a physician and a clinical pharmacologist by training, and I've been devoted to drug development for the past 20 years. Initially as an investigator at a drug research center in Barcelona, and then for the past 13 years working in an industry developing medicines for many diseases. And the last 6 years, I have devoted my professional life to the development of gene therapies for initially neuromuscular disorders and more recently neurodevelopmental disorders in pediatric patients. So the one topic that perhaps is top of mind for me in this context is informed consent. I think that is quite challenging and quite complex. Families really need to understand the evolving risk-benefit ratio. There's a lot of therapeutic misconception. And in many cases, families or parents need to make lifelong consent on behalf of their kids, impacting autonomy. So as a former researcher, I consented hundreds of participants for different clinical trials, but I never consented one patient for a gene therapy trial. And now that I'm faced with educating clinicians on how to consent prospective families for these type of trials, I encounter that this is profoundly different from therapies that are typically administered chronically.
Thanks, Sal. So I think people can see that we're bringing a diverse array of experiences to this topic. So Kara, why don't you start us off with giving us a case and some background that we can all focus on, and then we will just have some open discussion.
Sure, no problem. Before I jump into that, I just wanted to share this QR code, which will direct you to PGTME's webpage if you want to learn more, and I'll return to this later as well. So I'm going to go give a little bit of a background about the current state of gene therapy research before I start talking about a specific case. And there are contested and different definitions of gene therapy, but for the purposes of this talk, we'll use this simple one, which is this. So gene therapy seeks to modify or manipulate the expression of a gene. Gene therapies can be used for inherited genetic conditions or for acquired conditions, including some in the hematology and oncology spaces. And there are lots of people thinking about lots of different use cases for gene therapy. But for right now, and in the early stages of gene therapy development, they're targeting single gene mutations. So what most of the gene therapies right now have in common is that these conditions that they're targeting tend to be rare or can be ultra rare. And they are often life-limiting, meaning that eventually they will be fatal. So because of this, gene therapies are highly anticipated methods of treatment, especially for rare diseases with no other treatment options available. So far, only 2 gene therapies have been approved by the FDA, but estimates suggest that by 2025, the FDA will be approving between 10 and 20 cell and gene therapy products per year. So it's pretty clear that there's major growth coming down the pike in this area of medicine. One of the unique features of many gene therapies is that they're delivered through a viral vector, which means that viral DNA has been removed and replaced with a transgene that contains the correct copy of the faulty gene, which is causing the disease. And this is important because gene therapy recipients will develop an immune response to the vector being used. So this means that at the moment, gene therapies can be delivered only once. And this condition has a clear impact on the risk-benefit calculation that families are making and the decision-making process for parents, caregivers, and ultimately the whole family. So I'm going to take us through now, knowing that some of that background. Allison or Andrew, Sal, did you want to add anything there? Or should I keep chugging along?
I think I probably would just say that experts would probably want to quibble about every single statement you said, but we're trying to go very high level here.
Okay.
So bear with us if we left out some nuances there, but yes.
Yeah, we're making some broader generalizations here. So I'm going to go through this case study, which is based on a sort of composite of real or actual lived experiences of parents and families that we've encountered, as our working group has encountered and heard from. So the names are de-identified, but we're going to go with Martha. So Martha is the mother of 2 boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Her eldest child was diagnosed with Duchenne, which is a rare disease that affects only boys. But she did not live in the US, and there were no current treatments or trials or specialists in her home country. So knowing this and wanting to do everything she could to help her son, she actually her and her husband moved the whole family to the US in order to screen for an attempt to enroll her eldest son in a gene therapy clinical trial. And luckily, she was able to do this because she had both the financial means, and she was fluent, her and her husband were fluent in English, so they were able to more easily make this transition, although this was a pretty major decision and major move for her and her 2 sons. So the good news was her eldest son qualified for a Duchenne gene therapy clinical trial. However, her younger son, who also had Duchenne, was too young for the trial and was ineligible. So given this set of circumstances, there was a lot to decide and there was a lot of uncertainty. So because the gene therapy is delivered through a viral vector, trials will screen potential participants for antibody levels, because the body mounts an immune response to viral vectors. And so in order to qualify, somebody has to be below a certain threshold level of antibodies. And their concern was that her son, who was not eligible for the trial, might acquire the antibodies to the vector used and transmit them to the eldest child, making him ineligible for the trial. And this is a concern that a lot of families face, and I'm sure that Andrew can speak more to this. But essentially, because of this situation and wanting to protect the eldest son's eligible status, the family split into 2 separate households after having moved to a new country. And separation at any stage is a really difficult thing for families, but in this particular circumstance, it was a really stressful situation for both the parents and the children. And on top of this, there's a lot of uncertainties and weighing of risks and benefits, and considering and thinking about whether or not to seek treatment through a gene therapy trial sooner in order to potentially stop the disease from progressing too quickly, or should they wait for an approved treatment or for more safety data to come out. So these are the kinds of issues and that weigh on families considering enrolling in gene therapy trials. And they're really grappling with a high degree of uncertainty about safety and efficacy, and about how to maintain, a child's eligibility for a trial. So I think, illustrating this case.
Actually, Kara, can I say one more thing about that case before we go on?
Yeah.
So, and Andrew said a minute ago that his chief concern was this immunogenicity issue, this idea of, if you're exposed to the virus, does that render you ineligible to participate in a trial? Once you have received the viral product, does that mean you can never get redosed if perhaps you did have a benefit, but it ceases, it starts to wane over time? And I just wanted to point out in this particular case study, before we go on, that really the immunogenicity concern is a two-way street. You're worried about exposing the child who's entering the trial so that they don't lose trial eligibility. So it's, little brother could be a source of infection that would harm big brother's chances of joining a trial. But alternatively, big brother is definitely going to be shedding the virus after he's given it. And you don't want him exposing the younger brother to this virus that could render him ineligible to receive a gene therapy further down the line, either in a gene therapy trial or once there's an approved product. So I just thought it was important to flesh out that the concern is on both of the siblings, and absolutely everything you just said about the financial stress, the uncertainty, everything else is absolutely right. I just wanted to emphasize that one point. So Kara, I'll let you keep going, and then, like I said, I know Andrew flagged the immunogenicity as his main concern, so we'll come back to him and let him talk more about that in a minute.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for adding that. I just wanted to also highlight that Dr. Bateman House and our group's co-chair, Laisha Shaw, along with the former project manager, actually wrote a paper on this specific issue of discordant eligibility for siblings in on-trial compassionate use of gene therapy. So I think, why the reason we sort of pulled together this story and this case study is to illustrate the 5 issues that our group has decided to focus on. There are many, as everyone has mentioned, but the 5 include informed consent, which Sal mentioned at the beginning, and how to ethically do informed consent in the gene therapy space, what that entails, what that process looks like, how do sponsors, how do clinicians, how are they best informed, and how can they better inform and communicate information about the trial to families and caregivers. Risks versus benefits is another sort of ethical umbrella topic that we focus on, because as I've mentioned, there's a lot of factors that really increase the stakes of this decision making and deciding whether or not to enroll in a gene therapy trial. So weighing the risks and benefits in this space is a unique sort of ethical concern. Immunogenicity, which Allison touched on, right, is this issue of because of the manner in which gene therapy is delivered, the recipient will develop an immune response, and there have been potential concerns about immunogenicity or toxicity and other maybe unintended immune consequences. The lived experience is actually a subgroup that our working group has, and it really is the lived experience means the opportunity cost, socio emotional impact, psychosocial impact of participating or considering gene therapy, not just for the child, but for the family and extended family. And so there's a lot of discussion about the high cost of gene therapies, which is clearly of great concern and touches, I'll talk about that shortly, with equity, but we're also really interested in the opportunity costs, right? Parents or caregivers might have to take leave of work in order to enroll a child in a gene therapy trial, provide childcare for siblings, travel long distances. Sometimes, their child uses a wheelchair, so they need different accommodations. So we're really interested in what that experience is and learning more about it. And then, of course, equity. Thinking about who has access to gene therapies, who learns about gene therapy trials in the first place, where those specialized centers are, and how that impacts who gets gene therapy and who gets to be a part of gene therapy research. So those are just 5, and they're all, I tried to make a big Venn diagram. They're all intersecting, and tangled up together. But those are the main targets of our working group, and I think set the stage well for the rest of our discussion today.
Thanks, Kara. That was great. You want to tell them a little bit more about what PGTME has done on this area, and then we'll get into our discussion?
Sure. So let me make it big again. So these issues that I just mentioned is what our group focuses on, and we have a tripartite mission to research, educate, and develop policy guidance where and when possible for pediatric gene therapy research. So on the left, this is just an example of a week-long lunchtime lecture series that we host every year. And you can see this past year's theme was really focused around uncertainty, and sort of balancing hope and uncertainty, and how to communicate about uncertainty from clinicians to the participants, and how to build accountability with the larger patient communities. So that's just an example of one of the kind of educational events we do. And I got really excited about making QR codes, so I made another QR code to our YouTube channel, and you can view all of the videos from our past lecture series there. And I will, at the end, I'll pull up our contact info, so you will have that as well.
Thanks, Kara. So I promised Andrew that we were going to come back and talk more about immunogenicity, since you flagged that, and I think we've already started that conversation. So why don't we go ahead and do that? Tell us, what it is that concerns you most about it, above and beyond what Kara and I have already flagged. And as I am encouraging us to have this conversation, I invite Sal and Kara also to join in, because what we're trying to do is not only to identify ethical concerns, but where possible to signal, responses. What are possible policy responses? What are possible, guidances we can give to people about how to address these issues? So Andrew, the floor is yours, but Sal and Kara, you're welcome to jump in at any point.
Yeah, well, listen, you're going to have to jump in, because this is a topic like immunogenicity that we can sort of riff on for the next 2 or 3 hours. We can take up an entire morning at this ethics council on this one issue alone. So I'll try to be as brief as I can. But the concerns that I have stem from sort of an organizational perspective and also a personal perspective. So for us, as our son was gearing up to enroll in this trial, we've looked at this for a long, long time as sort of like the best hope for, you hate to say the term cure, but that's how patients and families look at this, the best hope for a cure or the best hope for something different. And you only really have one shot at that next best hope or that next best curative idea. But even to get there, you have to make sure that your child doesn't have pre-existing antibodies, that they haven't sort of been exposed to the viral vector that's being used in whatever gene therapy project that you're enrolling your child in or that you're being enrolled in yourself. And a lot of the time, you're exposed to that at an early age, at a very young age, preschool years, kindergarten years, and it sort of attaches itself harmlessly onto like a cold virus. And you never know whether you've been exposed to, let's say, viral vector, an AAV8 or an AAV9 or a 2, the different types of vectors that are used in these gene therapy projects. And for us, we've waited for so long for this project to sort of come along. We've spent a lot of time and energy and money trying to make sure that it could get off the ground, always thinking in the back of our mind that this might be the future for our son. And as things got closer, we still didn't have any answers as to whether he'd ever been exposed to this viral vector before. And so we went many number of months early for the sort of pre-screening, which includes testing to see whether he has antibodies to the AAV8 vector. And sure enough, he hadn't been. And for us, we were obviously very overjoyed, but then left with a lot of questions. We have 6 months now until trial, until infusion date. What do we do? Do we go home and live life normally? Do we send him out in crowds? Do we hop on trains? We're in Italy at the time, in Naples, and if you've ever been to Naples, those trains are slammed 100% of the time, worse than you could ever imagine, with people just all the time. Our world became very, very different. Everywhere we looked, we saw potential sources of infection, sources of viral transmission that could have impacted what we've been waiting for over the last 15 years. And so for us, we had a lot of conversations with our genetics team, with the principal investigators, with other families that have been through this. And we decided to sort of shut things down for those few months prior to trial date and prior to his infusion. That was really, really hard. You are basically staying home. It's easy for us all now. We've done it with the pandemic. I mean, I was one of the first that did sort of a pre-pandemic, stay at home, don't go anywhere, wipe your groceries down, do the works. But at the time, it was sort of unheard of. There was another family that we knew of in the United States, good friends of ours, that actually did the same thing. But they stayed away from public for 2 solid years, knowing that this was their only chance that their daughter had. For us, 6 months, it was okay, but it is difficult. It's more sacrifices that you have to make. It's more concerns that other family members have. It's taking kids out of school. It's taking kids out of sports. And so from a personal perspective, that was sort of some of the issues that we grappled with. From an organizational perspective, what we also saw was that this trial was going to be very, very popular. And we had families calling us from all over the world to see if they could also be tested, to see if their children had pre-existing antibodies for this study. And they wanted to know immediately. They wanted to know long in advance, even if they weren't even going to be considered for the trial. They wanted to know that perhaps sometime down the road they would have an opportunity to be a part of this trial. And all of a sudden, a lot of other ethical issues and concerns just popped up into my mind. Is this appropriate to do? Is there social supports available for families that find out maybe over the telephone or via an email from somebody that they do have pre-existing antibodies? How are we going to go about dealing with those families that have been working so hard to get this gene therapy project off the ground for all these years that now find out they can no longer be a part of the trial? Are they going to work to sort of change trial eligibility criteria if they find out that their levels are sort of just over the allowable limits, etc.? And so I don't think we were prepared at the time for dealing with all of that. I do know that as the trial started to get going, we knew we needed to enroll more patients, and we brought a lot of patients in after I'd had all of those concerns and did that testing, but in a very controlled atmosphere, a very controlled sort of setting, so that there was help on hand, people to interpret results, understanding that, you know, pre-screening doesn't guarantee you access to the trial, you know, down the road. It does turn out that a number of those patients that pre-screened in with us here in Canada, they did go on to participate in the trial, and they were part of that study population. But we sort of learned from those concerns. And then finally, I guess, not finally, because I have 1,000 concerns with this topic, but I guess I go to where we stand now with my own son. At the time, we had understood that Isaac was getting in at the highest dose. I mean, we've been involved with this for so long. We've seen trial protocol evolve over time. And we had, based on lab studies, the principal investigators had pegged the dose that Isaac was going to get as being the one that they felt was the most efficacious dose. And the hope there was that he would have this one infusion and then would no longer need enzyme replacement therapy. He'd be making his own enzyme, enough enzyme that it would sort of be at a therapeutic level. And we had all the hopes in the world that this was going to be the case. Unfortunately, after Isaac's dose and we started collecting that data, we all needed to reevaluate what that data looked like, and it looked like there wasn't enough. And so based on Isaac's results, that dose was then doubled for the next patients. And that's the nature of clinical studies. That's the nature of looking at this type of clinical trial. You just never know. Even for somebody like me that's been living this over the last 15 years, who thought we knew as much as we possibly could, you just don't know. And so Isaac didn't get enough. And now we've had to refocus and reshift our efforts into how can we now go about a couple of things. How can we make sure that somebody like Isaac can be redosed up to a proper level so that he has the most efficacious dose? Because the data that's coming out after Isaac looks unbelievably incredible, and we want our own son to be able to have that same type of response to the gene therapy as somebody else. So is it looking at how do you redose, or is it looking at switching vectors? And then the other thing is we want to make sure that those patients that got in at an even earlier stage of the trial can also be redosed, but also for us, that patient population that had early exposure to that viral vector, we want to make sure that there's an option available for them as well. And so that, to me, when I think about gene therapy, the ethical issues, the problems, the things that keep me up at night, that's what I mean by immunogenicity.
That was awesome, Andrew. And like you said, we could talk about immunogenicity itself just for an hour. So I'm sure we're going to circle back to it in a minute. But I do want to turn to Sal to talk about his informed consent concerns in just 1 second. Before we do that, Sal, I just wanted to throw 2 more quick factoids about immunogenicity out there, and maybe we'll return to them later. Kara mentioned earlier, you know, equity as being one of the key principles that we're concerned about in this area. And I just want to point out that when drug development efforts are involving viruses, they select viruses. So there's a selection of all the viruses in the world that could be used, certain viruses that will be used. And we know epidemiologically that these viruses occur naturally around the world in different prevalences. So what we have unfortunately found ourselves in a situation is that we may end up creating products that are going to be less usable in certain areas of the world simply because naturally there's more exposure to these particular strains of viruses there. So that's the one thing that I wanted to just raise as an equity concern. But let's put immunogenicity aside for a second. I'm sure we're going to come back to it. And Sal, you mentioned that you were an investigator, doing these informed consent conversations with patients, and now have sort of transitioned into the industry side where you're talking to clinicians about how to do this. What are the issues that are of most concern to you that you'd like to share with our audience?
Several, Alison, and I would start with ensuring that the clinicians who are going to be presenting these opportunities to prospective families actually understand the preclinical data. Gene therapy is very novel, and depending on the area of medicine, the medical specialty, not all clinicians are really aware and have a deep understanding of the preclinical data and of the science behind gene therapy. So being part of a biotech company, one of our top concerns is to try to provide some additional education so that clinicians can really present a balanced view of both the risks and the potential benefits that each one of these opportunities may carry. And we have realized over time that that is not enough, that we really have to partner with patient advocacy organizations around the world to try to also go directly to those families and present them with the same information. And we've learned that since the motivation is very high, we encountered families like Andrew's who are very well versed and many times end up asking more sophisticated questions than we get from people with an MD, PhD, and a specialty, just because that's really their kids who they are concerned about, right? So I think that we are trying to follow this two-pronged approach to really present a balanced view of risks and benefits. But it's quite complex because that balance of risks and benefits can be determined by myriad factors. And it's how potentially a patient can benefit from a gene therapy drug will depend on the type of disease that we're talking about, the type of mutation that those patients have, the age of those patients, the pre-existing immunity, comorbid conditions, other treatments that they have received, et cetera, et cetera. So in that document, and in that conversation, and in that ongoing dialogue that should be part of the informed consent process, I think that it's really quite complex to pack all of that information so that families can really make a truly informed decision that is at present time one that is really life-changing, could really be life-changing, because at this point in time, a gene therapy drug that is delivered with an AAV vector cannot be taken away and cannot be given a second time. There are many groups that are trying to find solutions for that latter problem, but currently that really hasn't been tried and been successful. So it's a huge challenge. And related to the potential benefits, and also a key part of the informed consent, is what Andrew was already alluding to, that hope of a cure and the potential therapeutic misconception that is associated with that. Because whereas in some contexts, it is true that some gene therapy products have yielded results that do resemble something that is close to a cure and something truly unprecedented, in some other contexts, it hasn't been as dramatic. So I think that it's very, very important for me as a former investigator and now leading clinical development of different programs to treat rare diseases, that families understand that in many situations, this is perhaps not going to be a cure, or we don't know, that this is really investigational, and that a long time needs to elapse until we determine what dose levels are going to be efficacious or safe. I mean, just Andrew's example just showcases that problem. The first dose was not really as efficacious as the dose that was much higher. In other contexts, though, some of the families who have elected to go with a lower dose, and many times they really cannot elect, it's just whatever it's presented to them, have benefit from a huge and dramatic improvement, and patients getting a higher dose have to grapple with safety events associated with higher doses. So these are just some of the issues that we deal with in terms of the presentation of the risk and benefit analysis. And I think that we truly need to use a multi-pronged and multi-model approach to really provide all of this information to prospective families and let them obviously digest that before making that decision. But then I think that the other issue that comes with this is we all know now that informed consent needs to be an ongoing process during the life of the study, right? So there's an interesting intersection with transparency, for instance, because in many of these clinical trials, they're open label, the results are being presented at a certain cadence annually or every 6 months at different medical meetings. And sometimes, importantly, biasing the expectations and triggering an evolution of those expectations from the patient population. So again, potentially feeding that therapeutic misconception, right? That perhaps the first few patients do incredibly well, they were very young, and then obviously families get very, very excited about something that really resembles a cure. Older patients come, they are not really getting the same results. What happened? So should we really be perhaps holding off before issuing a judgment on how good a therapy may or may not be when we only have information on a handful of patients? So that is another issue that I think about constantly. So I'm going to stop there for a second because I also could continue for a couple of hours on this topic, but just to set the tone on some of the things that I see as complex in the informed consent process.
So Sal, you mentioned transparency, and I'm glad you did, because we're going to go Kara in just a minute to talk about that. But before I let you escape, I want to press you on one issue that you didn't mention that I actually think is really important, because remember, we're not just talking about gene therapy, we're talking about pediatric gene therapy research. And so these are parents making decisions for their children, you know, intentions, doing the best they can for their kids, but they may not represent the kids want. Or as you said, you know, informed consent is a process that changes over time. It may be that over time, as they have experience with the trial, a child may decide they no longer want to participate. And especially if depending on the age of the trial subjects, they reach the age of maturity where they make the decision. And I just want to let people know that at least in the United States, the FDA is strongly recommending for many gene therapy trials that there be a 15-year follow-up period. So, you know, what do you do when that child who has been in the trial suddenly doesn't want to be followed up? You know, just trying to weigh the fact that we really want that data for the good of society, but at the same time, now we have an autonomous, you know, participants saying, I don't do this anymore. So can you talk about that complex set of issues? And then I promise we're going to go to transparency.
Absolutely. You know, that is fascinating. And thank you for reminding me of that. That is one of the most important things about the informed consent process as it relates to pediatric gene therapy clinical trials. And I don't really have an answer for that. I just think that it's quite important to recognize, that it touches on two basic tenets of biomedical research. On the one hand, respect, and as part of respect is the ability to truly withdraw from a clinical trial. So this doesn't apply to a gene therapy clinical trial in pediatric patients. So all of a sudden you're taking that element away, and obviously autonomy. And just as parents, they are making decisions on behalf of the kids that could be lifelong, and they could lead to incredibly positive outcomes, but sometimes not so. Sometimes no outcomes, or even potentially deleterious outcomes from a safety perspective. So I think that the one thought that I would offer there that really needs to be done more frequently by all of us in industry and by patient advocates, as well as by clinicians being investigators, is I think that we shouldn't be making assumptions that some of these participants are not able to understand exactly what they are getting, or what their parents are getting them into. I think that even though I don't know exactly how assent looks like in terms of a lifelong decision, at a minimum, we need to strive to provide information at a level that can be digested and at least explained to prospective participants starting at a certain age, whether that is 7 years of age, 8 years of age, or whenever that is determined by local and institutional regulations, the nature of the trial and what we are trying to accomplish in that gene therapy trial. And then as part of the process, maybe revisit that issue as participants grow. I think that it becomes part of their identity, and it determines their future in many ways. So I think that at a minimum, the one thing that we owe to these participants is to show respect by trying to at least provide context, and for that context to be updated on a regular basis with additional information. And then I think that from a scientific perspective, and especially for those patients who do not get the outcomes that we would desire them to experience, to really try to go back and honor that moral commitment of really trying to deliver those transformative outcomes that we have in mind at the outset of these gene therapy clinical trials. And one of them would be to really try to continue devising mechanisms for redosing, for instance, as an example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that was a difficult question, so thanks for letting.
Yeah, and I want to take a stab at that as well. And it does launch right into Kara's point on transparency as well. And I think, so my son just went through this. He just turned 18 and he was enrolled in the trial when he was 13 years old. And I think that there was an understanding at that time that sort of that graduation to adulthood would take place during follow-up of this trial. And the folks in Italy where our trial was located and is currently located, they did a very good job from an early stage, including Isaac in all discussions. That informed consent process that is, signed off on by parents, of course. He sat in on every single meeting. And so that idea of, filling as much information is in at an early stage was there. That transparency was there. That idea that this is a lifelong sort of commitment to make. I remember every single day that the principal investigator would come in and he would sit right on Isaac's bed and say, okay, you had 24 hours to think about this. Tell me what your questions were overnight. And they would sit for an hour, 2 hours sometimes. And I understand that that time is not always available for principal investigators. But for something this impactful, this important, this sort of seismic in nature, that time really does need to be found if at all possible. And so that transparency and that informed consent at an early age from Isaac, for Isaac was there. But also when he turned 18, that first meeting that we all had when he had to re-sign informed consent documents, etc., it wasn't just Isaac there. It was, this time, Isaac was there as the person, as the decision maker, but the principal investigators brought the parents in so that we could be a part of listening in on what was taking place and knowing, what the new commitment was as we're, renewing informed consent and evolving, what follow-up looks like, etc. So that while we didn't have ultimate decision-making authority, the reverse was true here, where we had all of the information and Isaac was signing off. So it was truly a collaborative approach. And I think that's a really good model to have for everybody that's out there. And it's not saying that, your child is going to be 17 and principal investigators and industry says it's time to get ready for that jump over to adulthood and that switch to who's the decision-making authority. It starts as early as you possibly can. And I think that that's a good spot to really jump into the transparency aspect that is so important and interesting to Kara. So I'll turn it back over to you, Allison.
Okay, so Kara, we keep talking about transparency. What is it that we really should be thinking about?
Yeah, I'm really glad, Andrew, that you brought up the story about, having somebody just answer all of your questions and having that time and opportunity. And I think, when I think about transparency, there's the immediate image is like, let's just provide all of the information. And I think, Sal, you're right in saying like, we should assume that these families can understand, tricky information. A lot of them have become medical experts in their rare disease overnight. But yeah, I think if we're looking towards best practices and solutions, I think a model like the one Andrew mentioned, where the whole family is involved at every step of the way. The child is involved whenever and however possible to the best of their ability. I think having this a back and forth and a discussion and learning in layers of learning and multiple visits and multiple discussions, I think that's how we learn best as humans, and there's no reason that doesn't apply in this space. The other thing that that I was going to say about transparency is that it's not just transparency for the families and for patients, but also for clinicians, like you both mentioned. So we actually, our working group held a series of meetings on the topic of antibody testing outside of clinical trials, because we heard from multiple different people that parents were seeking these antibody tests, these commercial antibody tests outside of clinical trials to try to determine whether or not their child might be eligible or whether they met a certain threshold of antibodies. Now, these, like Andrew mentioned, these tests, they might not apply 6 months down the line because you might have acquired that viral vector. And so this sort of issue was really concerning to us because we heard that, a lot of families got a certain level of antibody, got the test back, and they interpret it as they wouldn't be eligible for a certain trial. But different gene therapy trials have different antibody threshold levels or cutoff levels. So there's not necessarily one standard consistent level throughout all different trials and with all different sponsors. And regardless of these test results, if you're screening for a gene therapy trial, that trial will conduct its own antibody tests. So, one of the things we did is really to sort of bring together various stakeholders, which is, I think, what our group does best, and I think is really important in the effort and making efforts towards greater transparency, to really flesh out what these tests can and cannot tell people about antibodies, about their child's antibody levels. And so we've actually produced a sort of FAQ sheet based off of this, and it's still an ongoing project. But as a part of one of these meetings, we brought in somebody from one of these testing companies, these diagnostic testing companies, not a part of any specific gene therapy trial. And he actually reached out to me just a few months ago because he said that he had a few clinicians who were getting asked about antibody levels. So he actually wanted to provide them with the information about the utility of these tests so that families would be better able to understand. Many of them would still maybe decide to get this testing done, but at least they would know its relative like power or weight in this situation. So I think, in looking towards solutions, I think our group is really working to produce simple, digestible, sort of non-unbiased educational materials for specific topics like that. And I think given that a lot of these families are already in a highly stressful situation, it's a really everything feels really urgent. We really want people to be equipped and have enough of the information to know what they may or may not be getting into or what kind of tests they're getting. So that's, I'll stop there with my thoughts on transparency, but my general take is that like a multi-pronged layered approach. It takes time, it's ongoing. And it really requires a lot of back and forth between not just clinicians and patients, but between, researchers and clinicians and bioethicists and clinicians. And in that vein, I think that, having multiple people and different stakeholders like we are now at the table is really helpful and fruitful and towards those efforts.
Thanks, Kara. Want to be mindful of the time. As we said, we could talk about all of these topics for quite some time, but I want to ask any of the three of you or all of the three of you, of the things that you've identified as the issues of greatest concern to you individually, are there things that you see as there's an action item right now we can do? There's a policy or there's a practice that we could advocate for right now that would address one or many of these issues, or are these all things that are still going to have to be worked out? Go ahead, Kara.
I want the mic again. I think, something that's been really popular recently has been decentralized trials in the wake of COVID, and moving certain components of trials to, telemedicine components or other video components or virtual components. And I think this is really important in the gene therapy space. I think, even though not every part of a trial can be done virtually, I think, making as many of those visits virtual as possible, or to the greatest extent possible, is a really critical aspect towards increasing equity and increasing access to these trials for families who might not be able to move their whole household, or who might not be able to take leave of work so easily. And so I think, those two things are really tied together. And, I'm not a sponsor, so I don't know the ins and outs of what that entails and how hard that is and how tricky it is. But, we have seen it done pretty quickly in the last few years. And I think, in general, trials are moving in that direction, and it's really important for gene therapy to do the same.
That's a great example of concrete recommendation for a structural change that would have real impact. Sal or Andrew, either of you want to offer anything in terms of concrete policy recommendations at this point in time?
No, but I'll highlight. Well, actually, yes. There's lots that we can continue to advance and advocate. But I want to very quickly highlight that that decentralization is happening, and the pandemic really forced a lot of that to happen. I know that our trial that's located in Italy went about making sure that there were other sites within individuals' countries that they could at least get to. So it's still not all that decentralized, but it was still closer to home during pandemic, where travel restrictions were very difficult. And what I also understand is that things are reverting back to sort of that home site as this phase of the trial closes out. But it does highlight that that it's possible that data collection can take place, and that they can work together at local sites to make it happen. In terms of policy or concrete things that are taking place, I think sort of my topic of immunogenicity, we're seeing that evolve at a very, very rapid pace. Not only are investigators very interested in seeing this happen, industry's very interested in figuring out how we can sort of alleviate those concerns and redose patients that may have been dosed at a lower level, or the dose didn't work, or dose those patients that have unfortunately been exposed at an early stage. And so a lot of research is going into it. I know my organization is raising a lot of money to make sure that this current clinical trial for MPS 6 can begin to work on sort of those issues as well. I think that it might be important for regulators to look at sort of personalized vectors as well. At some point in time, we're getting a lot more information for what these vectors do in terms of safety and efficacy, and how they interact within the body. And so if you know a patient where you don't need to break the blood-brain barrier, can use an AAV8 and they have pre-existing antibodies to that. Is there a potential for that trial to just use AAV5 instead of going all the way back to those mouse models at a very early stage? Is that something that we can sort of pick up research at a later stage, knowing the safety value that exists on all of these vectors at this stage in time? That's, you know, probably a ways down the road, but it's something that we need to consider, seeing how we can continually evolve these vectors within a trial to best meet the needs of all patients that are out there. Sal would know a lot, you know, more about whether that's a distinct possibility, you know, in the early stages or in super late stages. But for me, that's something that we've identified as maybe let's spend a lot of time and effort and put some knowledge into whether those types of things are possible.
And I want to note we're almost at the end of our time, and I do want to ask each panelist for their closing thoughts. So Sal, I'm going to throw you. You're welcome to put forth an actual policy proposal that you think we're ready for, is right for now. Or if you don't have any, you're welcome just to move into your closing thoughts.
Yeah, I think that on the topic of informed consent, I think that it's important to maybe support all of the existing initiatives on patient-focused drug development, because if we are forced as an industry to really reach out to the patient populations who we're trying to serve at an earlier stage, we will be helping provide that risk-benefit analysis at an earlier time point, so that truly families can have more time to digest it at the same time that we're generating some of that preclinical information and presenting that to clinicians, regulatory agencies, and all of the other stakeholders. So FDA and EMA have very concrete policies in place that are now really forcing industry to make sure that we generate evidence that we have indeed been trying to reach out to those families and patients who live with these rare diseases, and that forces an exchange of information that could only help improve in the long run the informed consent process.
And like just point out that, as Kara said at the beginning, we're talking about just a vastly disparate array of diseases. So some are, you know, more chronic in nature, some are very rapidly acute, you know, some are more neurological versus other bodily organs. So to really understand that it's very hard to have a one-size-fits-all approach in this situation, and that we really do have to do that grounded work to understand the lived experience of the disease and the people and the families experiencing it in order to accommodate them appropriately.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a closing comment, I would want to go back to one of the comments that Karen made at the beginning of the panel on the number of gene therapy products that are expected to be approved by 2025. And that makes me think that, yes, all of these issues that we've been discussing for the past hour and a half or so are incredibly important, incredibly pressing, things that we have to work on for the next couple of decades. But I think that the future is really looking very promising for many patients living with rare diseases, because the issues that we're facing means that we're making progress in medicine, and that the practice of medicine is evolving and is changing, and it's allowing us to offer some of these patients options, and that is incredibly positive. And I am very, very hopeful that the solutions that families have in the future are much better than the ones that we have now. I know that we'll be able to figure out the issue of redosing. I know that there will be better vectors, non-viral vectors, etc. So the science will advance, and I think that the science has to advance in tandem with just addressing all of these bioethical issues that are the very nature of what we do nowadays, and that are very important for us to address.
And thank you so much for your role in advancing that science, also. Andrew, comments in a truncated form?
Yeah, I think I'm just going to echo what Sal said. I'm obviously very hopeful as well for the future. There's a lot in the pipeline. There's a lot that looks wonderful and is coming at us very quickly. What I would hope to see is that as industry is starting to evolve and the science is moving as fast as it is, that we see industry and payers evolving as well to ensure that once these gene therapies do hit the market, there's no delays in making them accessible for those patients in need. Because as we know, time ticks away very, very quickly for our families that are in need, and they don't have time to wait once there's an approval out there. We are going to see those approvals. I really hope that when those approvals come down the pipeline, we see almost immediate reimbursement through some good, careful collaboration between all stakeholders so that all of these innovative medicines get to those patients that are in need.
Thank you, Andrew. And again, thank you for your role in this ecosystem as well. Kara, closing thoughts from you, and then we'll let you close out the panel.
Sure. I guess my last thought is maybe for this bioethics, world bioethics audience. And that's just, why I love the field is because every situation is unique, and really brings its own, there's, our sort of core principles of bioethics, but each specific new medical technology brings its own set of complexity to think through. And I think, gene therapy is really promising to me because I've seen a lot of patient advocate and patient community involvement and partnerships with industry. And so I think, it's when you're designing or building anything, thinking about those concerns of the people they actually impact from the get-go and building that into the process is key. And so on that note, I would also, will state my hope that concerns about equity are also considered from the get-go and from the beginning, and not as an afterthought.
So with that, I think we're at the end of our allotted time. So Kara, you want to close us out? And again, we just thank everyone for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you everybody. We're sad we can't be there. We weren't able to be there in person, but please do feel free to reach out to us. Our emails are here on the left, and we are fairly active on Twitter as well, so please feel free to follow us. And my email is here, kara.hunt@nyulangone.org. If you'd like to be on our mailing list, we send out quarterly newsletters and annual reports. You can just send me an email and I can add you to that list. So thank you so much. Thanks for having us. We hope to be back here soon.